Hey folks, welcome back to Only Best Fantasy Novels. My name is Robin, and today we're going to talk about The Proof House by KJ Parker. And finally, I think I can say I understand what the principle is and how it actually impacts the story. I think. Anyway, what is the Proof House about? 3 years have passed since the events of Belly of the Bow, and Bardus has found himself on essentially as a sapper for the Empire, and they're attempting to break into a city that has been impenetrable for the last decade. The Empire, by the way, is about as far away from the previous environs as you can get. So, naturally, with Bardus being there, the siege finally succeeds, and the entire status quo of the geopolitical ramifications it has on this world is absolutely earth-shattering, basically. Like, it opens the door for true empire to begin. Um, yeah. So, like, you can, with no exaggeration, you can say that Bardus's presence and his actions in that siege begin a truly cataclysmic chain of events. So that's what the proof house is about, and the consequences of that, basically. Um, so this book wraps up the Fencer trilogy, and aside from the very initial opening of this trilogy, there's not much fencing that happens in here. Instead, in this outing, the aspect that KJ Parker decides to focus on is armor, and we find out all about making armor, testing armor, and specifically proof testing, because that's what the proof house is. After Bardus's success at the siege, he's promoted to this to a cushy position testing armor. Anyway, so he's there doing that before, of course, things escalate. But but yeah, so we find as this book slowly unfolds, and we catch up with the characters as they that we've met over the course of this series. Like, we find out that also the more things change, the more they stay the same. Like, everyone's just kind of treading water, doing their own thing, living their daily lives. And when you think about it, for most people, that's kind of how life was. Like, it's just one day after the next. There's not much variation, not much change. In the grand scheme of things, and that's we kind of see that play out with these characters to an extent, with the exception of the more catastrophic changes that have happened for some of them. Yeah, like, some of these characters, they've had very interesting character arcs, to say the least, over the course of both this book and the series as a whole. Some have just kind of been there. There is one in particular who, something very interesting happens to him on screen, which just makes it that much more confusing when he interacts with the other characters on this in this book. And what they said, now that I think about it, what they said at the very start of this video, where I think I finally understand the principle, scratch that. Because that particular part makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, given what we've learned of this world and how it works to date. But yeah, so another cool thing that I liked about, like, the characters in these books is that we as we now interact with them for the final time, and we now see how they like, where their stories are headed, and so it's they're just people. They're just basic. They're just regular people. In like in fiction, because characters need to do something, they have to have some agency to contribute something to the story. We tend to have characters who are almost, to an extent, they're kind of hyper efficient. They always seem to know what needs to be done at the time that it needs to be done. They're not necessarily right, but they kind of always have the answers, even if they have to kind of parse and dig their way through it. Not necessarily these Not necessarily regular people. Like, regular people often does not throw them outside of circumstances which they don't know anything about, and they're gonna flounder. And that's kind of what we see with some of these characters. Some manage to thrive in new situations, but most of them, they're never quite given the right set of circumstances to succeed. Instead, they're just kind of treading water, passing time, doing doing what they're familiar with, if they're even able to do that much. But yeah. And then we get to the actual story that's told in this book, and oh jeez, this is a very KJ Parker book. Is the only way I can see it. Like, there's political machinations that's happening, and it's very on the nose. It's very blatant. Like, you're told what's going on. Even the characters within the story, as they carry out these machinations, they kind of pinpoint the obviousness of what they're doing, to the point where it's almost like they're ridiculing the fact that they have to do it, but it's expected of them. So, for example, there's one scene where there's a spy in King Temrai's camp. He know he's a spy. They know he's a spy, but no one does anything. They just they just go about their daily lives, essentially. Things like that. Like, they openly have a discussion and these kind of things about this person being a spy, and absolutely nothing is done. In another book, that person gets snapped up and killed, or tortured and killed, and that kind of thing. Nothing in KJ Parker book. Never expect what you think you know happens in a story to happen in a KJ Parker book. The other thing about this book is that it made me realize, and I don't know why this didn't click initially, that over the course of these 3 books, a different Lorden has worn the Machiavellian master, the Machiavellian hat. In the first one, we had Bardus with the way he had to kind of step up and manage the siege of Pyramid. In the second one, we kind of got the exposure to Niesa and the business empire that she's built. And in this one, we get Gorgas and his take on nation building, I guess we can call it. And that's all I'll say about that, because holy crap. Gorgas is one of the more interesting characters in this entire series, especially after the way Belly of the Bow ends and his reaction to that scene. One of the things that was kind of less than satisfying in this book is that we get kind of like the fallout of how all of that played out. And yeah, like I made a guess as to how he would decide to proceed with given that events, and once again, KJ Parker does not disappoint. But yeah, like, and then over the course of this story, like, we just kind of have a meandering story that goes different places. Like, it's not to say that things don't happen. It's just that, once again, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about these books is that it's often about ordinary people thrown into extraordinary circumstances, and they don't necessarily succeed in rising to the occasion. Sometimes they fail. Sometimes it's a minor failure, and sometimes they fail in quite dramatic ways. And we see that firsthand. But this being the end of the series, of course, everyone kind of has to get their wrap up, and in many ways, most of them do. One character in particular, one of my favorite characters, her ending is it's kind of left quite open, because we're given a hint as to what her next steps will be, but that's pretty much the last we see of her. Like, we don't know if it was carried out, we don't know if she lives, if she dies, anything. It's left quite open, and I like that little bit of mystery to it, because once again, she's one of my favorite characters. Like, I'm on board with pretty much anything that she does. And yeah, like, as to the rest of the ending, it ends in the most KJP way possible. Like, what? We actually had a discussion before we even got around to starting this book in the Library of Alexandria's Discord for this read along. And we talked about the possibility of how things would play out with this ending. And I made a comment about some of the ways that KJ Parker's endings kind of tend to play out. I was not disappointed, is all I'll say about that. But one thing I also did want to touch on, like, over the course of this book, and it's really random to throw in at this point, given I'm literally talking about the ending, but one thing I did like is now that we have this empire in play, we kind of see, like, maybe let me. I don't think I'll get into that actually. I'll leave that for you if you ever decide to read this series, to read and find out. It's interesting, but it's about the way that Empire kind of functions, specifically within this world, and it set quite a bit. It set me thinking quite a bit. Because it's very different from what we've seen historically. Like when I think on an empire like the British Empire, at least. But at the same time, there's other empires like the Mongol Empire, which kind of operated similarly to it kind of had the foreign policy, we should say, that this empire seems to have. So yeah. All in all, though, really fascinating series, I'll call it. For me, honestly, I like this book, but I think the series peaked for me with The Belly of the Bow, especially that ending. Like that ending, it just completely blew my mind, and it would have been very hard for KJ Parker to top that kind of ending. And he doesn't even attempt it, for me at least. Instead, he just writes a entertaining wrap up to this series and these people and the lives of these people that we've been following. And I had a good time with it. Yeah. That's my thoughts on Defensive Trilogy. I listed it as one of my favorite series of 2024 with good reason. Yeah. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.